Media bias and misinformation can affect and persuade political elections and decisions. Early research on media bias interviewed U.S. voters before a presidential election, looked at the news material they consumed, and asked whether their opinions shifted based on whatever news media they had been exposed to. They found that people's political standpoints rarely changed due to the reason that Republicans were reading Republican newspapers and Democrats were reading Democratic papers. Therefore, people were only becoming more firm in whatever beliefs they already had. This shows how media bias affects elections because individuals will stick to certain views based on what they read, and due to this they have a hard time branching out and aren't willing to educate themselves on a differing opinion or ideology. Issue ownership is when, during election campaigns, American politics focus on certain issue areas for the benefit of Democrats, such as education or Social Security, while also focusing on issue areas for the benefit of Republicans, such as national security or traditional values. Media emphasis on particular issues where one or the other party benefits disproportionately or only certain views are covered is an important example of bias. Based on a study by Baum and Gussin in 2004, individuals tend to believe that there are certain biases in media depending on the network that they are shown, whether the information is for or against the beliefs of the individual. While when people were shown typically biased informational articles without being shown the name of the outlet, they didn't necessarily notice biases or notice a biased statement as quickly. This shows how media bias affects political elections because people will choose to listen to certain news outlets that contain their own opinions or beliefs, and will obtain information only from certain political sides or points of view, while dismissing the other side of an issue due to what outlet the information comes from, and they'll use that information when voting for a particular party. News media bias is commonly associated with framing information to influence readers' judgment. An example of this is the 2010, 2014, and 2018 Brazilian presidential elections, where four popular news outlets would use bias such as coverage, association, and subjective language in order to sway these elections. Coverage bias is how often one candidate or party is mentioned as opposed to the other. Association bias is when one candidate is associated with a negative concept while the other is not. Subjective language bias is when the media uses words that involve emotion or persuasive language and uses stereotypes to appeal to viewers. All three types of biases go into influencing presidential elections. A counterargument to the idea that media bias has a great effect on political elections decisions is shown through ideas like the minimal effects theory. The minimal effects theory in political science is the hypothesis that political campaigns and media only marginally persuade or convert voters. One of the issues with minimal effects theory is that it usually remains fixated on the news as the only factor and does not consider other platforms such as social media. Similarly, minimal effects theory is an old theory dating back to World War II and does not account for technologies that we have today where we get our information from, such as smartphones, which we use almost all of the time. Another counterargument to this claim is that philosophers and great thinkers have significantly influenced the field of political communications by trying to understand transformations such as political, social, psychological, and economic change in modern industrial history. However, political communication has changed over time by becoming increasingly detached to institutions such as public schools, political parties, and civic groups, which used to be great references for receiving and interpreting political messages and content. Information channels today have become more individualized rather than conceiving of mass media. According to the United States Census, 61.4% of voting-age citizens voted in 2016, which isn't much of a difference from the 61.8% in 2012, even with advances in technology and information between these elections. However, while the total numbers haven't changed much, it's the demographics within the numbers that show a large shift. Voting rates have historically varied by race and Hispanic origin. In 2012, voting rates for non-Hispanic blacks were higher than non-Hispanic whites for the first time in this series. In 2016, turnout increased to 65.3% for non-Hispanic whites, but decreased to 59.6% for non-Hispanic blacks. So while statistically there didn't seem to be much of a difference between elections, the demographics of voters changed historically. Therefore, it's proven that media bias and misinformation affects and persuades political elections and decisions through issue ownership, coverage bias, association bias, and subjective language.